My research for a road trip to Louisiana did not prepare me for the young black boys walking down the road in Jeanerette. I saw them on a hot summer Saturday afternoon between torrential thunderstorms when the ground was completely saturated. And their playfulness reminded me of my own childhood, splashing with my cousins through the warm water of the steaming South. The smell of that wet land, the sound of old hymns, and then muttered words of grace before every family meal has bound my life to those boys across our generations, our geographies, and our many other divides. Our lives are a world apart and yet also inextricably intertwined. And as I made my way across town to the Catholic cemetery in search of gravestones from my father's family lines, mostly what I found were the living descendants of the people my ancestors enslaved. Old black men buying Michelobes at the gas station, young black women waiting at traffic lights. Our bloodlines commingled in that soil. After the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, and the national unrest that followed us into the summer of 2020, I fell down a rabbit hole online, digging through my ancestry, rattled by the brutality that I found in my family story. My trip to Louisiana then became a kind of field investigation. I didn't know where I was going or what I was looking for, but what I found was the undeniable role of the land in binding this beautiful, diverse nation together. Our lives are not separate. Often when we talk about slavery in America, we talk about the impacts on the lives of the descendants of enslaved people, but the stories of slavery are also my stories. I learned on that trip that the little white infants of my ancestors were nursed by enslaved black women. The young free boys in my family were given enslaved girls as attendants. At every turn, the lives of enslaved people were fraught with danger that ranged from soft daily abuses to death. And for my ancestors, at least for those who were enslavers and hired overseers, every moment required a constant and conscious violence. Physical, psychological, and sexual violence against the natural and urgent instincts of enslaved people to resist, revolt, and avenge. And that violence was taught to their children and was passed down for generations, and it survived well beyond the emancipation of slaves. For a century after the Civil War, it came in the form of lynchings, convict labor, Jim Crow laws, and hate groups. Today, it is government policies and private sector practices that ensure mass incarceration, income inequality, and voter suppression. What I saw on that trip was the inseparability of the lives and stories of the oppressed and the oppressors. They lived in such close quarters they would have felt each other's breath. They could have interpreted every flinch. Their lives and their stories were not separate, and neither are ours. I did not inherit the wealth of my ancestors, but I did inherit the world that they created, one that has clear advantages for me and measurable, significant disadvantages for those boys in Jeanerette. And today we are living in the landscapes of those legacies of that violence. Down in Louisiana, you see it belching from the petrochemical plants that replace the old plantations along the river road and spilling their chemicals disproportionately on the lives of Black people. You see it in lower incomes, lower rates of educational attainment, higher rates of unemployment, incarceration, and death, poor public health standards, and all kinds of things we have all heard about a lot. And of course, Louisiana does not bear that burden alone. Those legacies are written across our land. When we talk about the cowboys and the frontier families and the cattle ranchers of the Wild West, we talk about them as if they're completely different from the land theft, war, and genocide of hundreds of Native nations. Those are not separate stories. When we talk about aspirational tales about the open road, highways, automobiles, the prosperity of the suburbs in the last century, we talk about them like they're completely separate from the destruction of urban communities, neighborhoods that at the very same time were being torn apart by those very highways, redlined by racial intolerance, disinvested and essentially left to die. Those are not separate stories. And today, in those same urban communities, we find powerful new streams of violence, a juggernaut of capital, a new generation of investors claiming those communities largely for somebody else, often unfettered by the kinds of policies and regulations that might protect people who stuck through those hard times. Think about it, the so-called decline of urban America in the 20th century and the urban renaissance playing out in downtowns across the nation today are not separate stories. They're intimately related. And they also overlap with some of the most beautiful stories of American history. Civil rights movement, gay liberation, local movements for historic preservation and environmental protections, all of these stories bind us together in this land. And they shape what is possible and what is not possible in our lives because they physically reshape the land. I'm talking about highways, zoning, and landscape buffers. I'm talking about the Confederate soldier standing on a pedestal down in the civic square being honored for mistakes that man made. I'm talking about the reasons that Iowa is 90% white. These real-life manifestations of our artificially separate stories have continually reinforced our social, cultural, and political divisions. So stories like the Wild West and the open road, which started out as lies, have translated into more lies. Today we talk about flyover country and the urban-rural divide, concepts designed to divide us, concepts that allow ourselves to think of ourselves as different in ways that we're not, allow us to see our lives as separate in ways that they are not. We've essentially built a nation of divisions, and today we are complicit in the maintenance of those divisions. When we look at the traffic jams and media outlets that separate rural and metropolitan America, that's on us. We're doing that right now. We have to recognize where those divisions are made in our landscape and address them, and we need to do it quickly because we're not talking about abstract populations of people. We're talking about us. We're separating ourselves from us and from our best lives. Imagine, though, if we told different stories, or more accurate and inclusive versions of the same stories. Imagine if we wrote those stories into the land with the same effort and intention and expense that was required to write those lies. We would begin to see connections where today we see only barriers. And you may think I'm talking about metaphorical connections, but I also mean literal ones, because often they are the same. When I was in college, I spent a year abroad in Paris studying architecture, and it changed my life. I recognized the role of the city in shaping my life, making something possible that I hadn't even known before. And when I got back to Atlanta, I got stuck in traffic. And after a while, I started to recognize that highway is a barrier between myself and the life that I wanted. Not only could I not go in the direction I wanted or travel in the way that I wanted, but the highway was creating a way of life and culture that was wildly out of sync with what I was looking for. I didn't really know what to do, but I started imagining something else. And in an epic story, Atlanta fell in love with my idea. The Atlanta Beltline is an idea to repurpose a 22-mile loop of old railroads circling the city with a new kind of infrastructure for a new way of life. It's a very big story. It was lifted to life by a grassroots movement of people who fell in love with an idea for their future. That's the future we want. And then they started to summon the resources and service to that vision. Today, it's a $4 billion infrastructure project, so it's well underway, but we have a long way to go, and it is far from perfect, believe me. But what it's doing is illustrating what's possible when we organize our capital budgets and public policies and put them in service to the kinds of lives that we want. It changes things. I grew up stuck in traffic. My kids know in their gut that the fastest way to school or to the grocery store is on their bike. That doesn't mean they always go that way. But it's proof that the Beltline is changing the physical form of the city. It's making that way possible. It's also changing the way that we think about the city and what our expectations are for living there and for our lives. And it's important to remember that because when you're standing there looking at it, what you're looking at basically is a few very long slabs of concrete. Again, we got a long way to go. What you're really looking at is a historical division being transformed into both a physical and literal meeting ground. And it's working. A few months ago, I was walking home on the Beltline, and this older white woman came up to me. She wanted to thank me for for the Beltline and tell me how much it means to her life. And I get that a lot, actually. People tell me it's either the reason they moved to Atlanta or the reason they stayed. It's making Atlanta seem viable as a place they want to invest their lives. And she said she lives in the suburbs. She drives 15 miles into the city 3 times a week to walk along the Beltline. It's good for her health. She's 82 and it's good to be active. But she went further and she said, I've learned so much about people who are different from me. Think about that. She's making an effort to come to this meeting ground 3 times a week to be with people who are different from her. She had expectations for them, but they changed her expectations. She saw them as beautiful in ways that she didn't before. She sees them as contributing to her life, making her life richer in ways that she never imagined. She sees them in her story. And importantly, she also sees herself in theirs. That's culture change. That's what the Beltline was designed to do. That's literally the thesis, but it's the kind of culture change we need if we have any chance of addressing our big challenges ahead. Whether we're talking about a national housing crisis or the global climate crisis or any intersecting crisis you want to talk about, we need to be doing stuff differently. What we're doing is not working. And we need to compel people to action to transform these physical divisions in our land so that we see each other again. I love to talk about transportation plans because I'm a city planner and I don't know why the hell we do transportation plans. I mean, is it about efficiency for cars or for the people in the cars? And what if they want to go a different way? And where are they going anyway? And are we helping people who don't have access to transportation and need access? Are we helping people who have a lot of access? They're just stuck in traffic because everybody wants to be where they are and we're going to smooth out their lives for a couple more months. Transportation for who? Transportation to what end? We have to be able to answer those questions if we have any chance of aligning our capital budgets and policies with the kinds of lives that we want. Those budgets for transportation, but also for green space, housing, economic development, education, social services, all of the things that we do should be put in service to the kinds of lives that we want. And that sounds really simple, right? And obvious, but I'm here to tell you that that is not how we do things. That's not what's done. I'm writing a new book right now. It's called American Land. It's basically designed to convince you of that very basic fact. But as I'm writing it, I keep hearing in the back of my mind that old famous patriotic folk song, This Land Is Your Land. And if you know that song and why Woody Guthrie wrote it in the 1940s, he was coming from the Dust Bowl as one of the Okies headed to California where they were not wanted. And he's writing about this beautiful land that we have, as many patriotic songs do. He's writing it as both a claim and a challenge. This land is our land, but also we have to make sure this land is our land and that everybody's included, the Okies and everybody else. And to do that, we have to ask these questions. Who is it for? Who makes the decisions? Who benefits from those decisions? Because if we want our land and our lives to include those boys in Generat, we can't just think about them when we answer the questions. We have to ask them the questions. We have to listen to their answers, and then we have to make sure that they have the resources they need to build the lives that they want, knowing that if we do that hard work and sacrifice, that our lives will be richer in the process. And if we took that approach to all the divisions in our lives and across this country, imagine how much better connected, safer, cleaner, more resilient this beautiful nation can be. Thank you all very much.